Hello everyone, and welcome to this Threshold review. In this video, we're going to be reviewing Tivat by Pyreegue and Co. This is the developer's first scenery for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, so we are really excited to get into it. If you're new to the channel, scenery reviews go like this. We're going to be looking through the textures, the modeling, the accuracy, the atmosphere, the performance, and the price of the scenery, and then once we're done going through all of that, we will give the scenery a score out of 10, with 1 being the worst and 10 being the best. So without further ado, let's get on with the review. The first thing we're going to take a look at is textures. The first thing we're going to look at in the texture department are the taxiways, and then we'll look at the runway in a second. It looks like they are using the default textures right here for the taxiways, and I have mixed feelings about developers using the default taxiways because I've seen developers use non-default taxiways, so ones that they made themselves, and I think it looks really fantastic at an airport. But in this case, I actually think that the taxi lines correspond really well with the rest of the scenery. We'll get into this later, but the lines, the color of the lines are actually very, very similar to the way that the lines are in real life. So these colors actually complement the scenery, and it works really well since this is accurate to the airport in real life. Along with the taxiway lines, the ground textures are also default, it looks like. Same with the runway. And I came to this conclusion by looking at the default airport compared to the scenery that I was provided with. So overall, it looks like these are all default textures, and while I typically am not a fan of default textures being used in payware scenery, in this case it actually works rather well for the scenery because of the colors. Another thing in the texturing department that is default is the taxiway indicator markings. These are default as well, and we'll talk about how I feel about that in a moment once we get on to the modeling. Now, a quick note before I get on to some non-default textures. I reviewed all of the scenery on ultra settings to make sure that I was judging the resolution of the textures when the resolution was actually turned all the way up in the settings. So right now we are recording on medium settings, which is one step lower from what I usually record on. We'll get to that in a moment, but I looked at all the textures on ultra. So this scenery has been reviewed on ultra settings. With that said, though, there are still some inconsistencies in the resolution of textures, and this also happened with Orbex, and I think that this has to do with scenery developers using some of their own default textures in conjunction with default textures that Microsoft provides scenery developers. So we can see right here, these textures look fairly solid, I think. And you can't really tell that they are low resolution from far away. You'd have to be really close. Even from this distance, they look pretty solid. But if we go over here to the terminal, we will notice that the textures actually look as if they are a higher resolution. So we'll look at this for reference right here. You see how these textures, as you get to this distance, you can see the low resolution of them. However, when you get closer here, and actually here where the light is shining, that's a better example, these textures look like they're a higher resolution. I think that this has to do with default textures that the developer is importing. You can also see that right here as well. You can see the lower resolution textures right here. So it was a little bit confusing at first, but I think that that's something that has to be worked out on Microsoft's end. Inside the airport, there's also some really nice texturing done. It does look a little bit weird, the ceiling having such a shine to it. I wouldn't expect that, and that doesn't really align with the real airport, but we'll get to that shortly. And also the shininess is a little bit off, but the resolution of the textures is absolutely beautiful. This looks fantastic. Everywhere you look, the whole terminal is shining and looks super duper nice. Another thing as well is that for performance, it seems like the developer has put lower resolution textures in less important areas, and that is a really great job by the developer, making sure that everybody gets good performance. Another great place to look at the texture resolutions is outside. I think everything looks fantastic over here because there's no real reason that you would end up being this close and starting to see the textures get blurry. The resolution and quality of the textures is fantastic. The same can be said for the ground vehicles and the vehicles around the airport. Although some of them do look a little bit weird, these vans look like they have little dents in them on the side. Overall, it's done rather well. These cars look like actual cars, and the fact that there is a diverse library of different cars in the parking lot is a very nice touch. I do think, however, that these stairs are a little bit too shiny, and it's actually rather distracting. Typically, air stairs are a little bit more weathered, and seeing this shiny newness is a little bit off-putting, as I said, and I would have liked to see maybe a little bit of weathering put into this. However, I am not entirely sure if these are default objects that are provided. So if these are default objects, then Microsoft, come on, you gotta make these a little bit less shiny. That's not accurate. The same can be said for these little luggage containers here. I'm not entirely sure if these are custom or not. If they are custom, they look a little bit too new, but if they're not custom, then I think that Microsoft should back off a little bit on the newness, and that developers should also not be using these textures because they are so off-putting. They look out of place with their shininess. The top of the airport is also done really well. I like the texture resolution here, not too high, not too low. It's nice to look at from a distance. Looks a little bit blurry once you get closer, but that's okay because you're not going to be looking at the roof that much. The thing I like the most about the roof, though, are these air vents right here. They're done extremely well, and they actually look like real metal. These appear to be custom because I was looking at some other default airports, and it doesn't look like any of them look exactly like this. But regardless, really great job by the developer making sure that these look great and accurate. Moving on to the modeling, the airport exterior is done fantastically. The airport looks exactly as it does in real life. I didn't even notice a minor difference in the way that the airport looks here compared to real life, and everything is very accurate. However, although I do like the inclusion of the inside of the terminal, it is not entirely accurate with the way that the terminal looks in real life. I already talked about how the ceiling is a little bit too shiny, and overall the terminal just feels a little bit too bright, especially compared to the images that I have seen of the terminal. However, the general layout of the terminal interior is done relatively well. As I alluded to in the texturing section, however, these taxiway signs are not custom. Not a huge fan of that. I don't like how developers keep on using non-custom taxiway signs just because I think that the taxiway signs provided by Microsoft are a little bit too bright and they have too much contrast to them. I would have loved to see the developer actually make custom taxiway signs instead, because I think that that would add a lot to the scenery. However, although I can harp on the colors of the taxiway signs, the accuracy of them in terms of the way they are modeled is done solidly. Closing up the modeling section, we're going to take a look at the layout of the airport, and the layout of the airport very closely follows its real life counterpart. The developer has done a fantastic job at making sure that the runway looks accurate to the way that it does in real life, and that the taxiways also follow suit. Another thing with the modeling that is done relatively accurately are the custom objects that are found inside the Tivat area. I've popped an image on the screen right now showing where all of them are. It's going to disappear right now. Now we're looking at the cruise ships. I think the cruise ships are rather representative of the way that the other textures are. They have a high enough resolution that they look great from the air, but not a high enough resolution where it would actually kill your frames. So I think that these are done really well, and that characteristic that I just mentioned with the higher resolution, that follows suit into the other custom objects as well. So the modeling on these is done fantastically, but it's not done to the point where it will tank your performance dramatically. As for the accuracy of the airport has the default sounds that come with Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, so that is absolutely a plus. There are also ground vehicles which tend to move around the airport every once in a while, and that absolutely adds to the atmosphere. And as if it's on cue, we can see an aircraft that's about to take off right there. The airport also has live traffic, which is fantastic and adds to the accuracy even more. But it doesn't feel like the airport is cluttered. It feels like there's a decent amount of traffic given the size and scale of the airport. Now that we've covered the textures, modeling, accuracy, and atmosphere of the airport, we're going to talk about the performance of the airport before getting into the price. We're going to do this in the TBM right here. We're going to start up the engine, take off, see what kind of performance we get while we're doing those two things, and then we will talk about the performance of the airport. So as we taxi to the runway, let's talk about performance briefly. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I am on medium settings. However, I normally record this flight simulator in high-end settings. There's a very important reason for that. I get a pretty significant frame hit whenever I increase the settings to where I normally am, and you simply could not watch the video if that were the case. I'm talking a serious frame hit. I normally get in the ballpark of 40 to 45 frames per second on the ground whenever I am at a low density airport like this. However, even on my regular settings, I was getting 10 to 15 frames per second. So there's a very, very significant loss of frames with this scenery. So in order to actually get a good video, I need to bring down the quality of my settings significantly. I think this has to do with the interior of the terminal. I think that there is just too much reflections going on in there, and in order to make it look exactly how the developer has tried to replicate it. But I think that this kills frames quite a bit, and it was only when I dropped my settings that I noticed a frame rate increase. So although everything that you're about to see, me taking off, me taxiing, all of that is going to look absolutely fantastic and it's going to look nice and smooth, this is because I have my frames down a full setting compared to where the airport was at previously. So as we see on the takeoff, still nice and smooth, and we're going to make our typical left-hand turn pointing towards the airport right now to get as much of the rendering as possible to see how it does. And as I mentioned, you will notice that the airport does very well and that we actually have a very, very solid FPS. However, as I mentioned, this is one tick down, so that is one thing to keep in mind. This scenery is rather heavy on frames. Now, your mileage may vary. This could be just something on my system, but I have seen a significant drop in frames. So let's talk about the price. This scenery is going for 1280 euros right now, and I think that that is a fairly respectable price. However, I would like to see it lowered a little bit considering the fact that default textures are used. I'm not a huge fan of this new standard of using default textures inside the simulator but still charging scenery prices. This isn't a harp specifically on this developer. Other developers have done this as well. So Tivat does not stand out in this respect. Tivat is just following a general trend that I see developers doing. So I would like to see it lowered a little bit more. Everything in this scenery is solid. It is up to par with what I have seen so far, if not better in certain areas, especially since there is interior modeling of the terminal. However, the frame loss is significant. I had a very, very heavy frame loss, and that is a major takeaway from this scenery. So if the developer is able to update their scenery in order to increase the frame rate of the scenery, then this is a solid 9 out of 10. However, I have to take a full point off for the heavy frame loss, since that is simply unacceptable and I shouldn't have to turn my settings down in order to get a great experience with this scenery. I hope you enjoyed this threshold video. If you did, be sure to give it a like. If you agree with my review, let me know in the comments below. And if you disagree with my review, please let me know as well. If you like this video and you'd like to see more like it, please consider subscribing. We would love to have you subscribed. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next review.